Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second roundtable organized by the Forens research team on the future of open web and crypto. Today, we're going to talk about the future of corporate governance in the era of DLT with Yei Sung Kim, a business transformation leader specialized in supply chain and transportation, a blockchain expert, and lead inventor of a freight system blockchain solution. So thank you, Yei, for joining us for this discussion.
My
And
pleasure.
I think we can start the conversation, maybe starting from your experience working in the world of corporate governance as DLT expert. So, what is the general attitude that you see in the corporate world towards blockchain innovation? And do you think that the adoption of blockchain solutions are seen kind of an inevitable trend that they will have to follow?
I wish it were an inevitable trend for corporations to take it on. I'd be retired by now, but I what I've heard the sentiment a lot from our clients is that they love the idea of it, the efficiency it brings, the transparency, and bringing traditional players who don't necessarily trust each other onto a single source of truth. But the sentiment I do hear a lot is that they're waiting for the leader or the gorilla in the room in the industry to take it on first. And then they would like to be a follower to see what the adoption was like, what were some of the pitfalls, what were some of the successes, and then what's that established technology that they can follow or the infrastructure they can follow. So some of these giant corporations, one of my clients is even an oil and gas super major, was saying that they wouldn't even be a fast follower in this space. They would be a slow follower in this space. So getting traditional players who are competitors or even working with other parties who might be competitors with each other and having them use a single source of truth without figuring out who is the actual owner of this data and who gets to manipulate this data. That's been a big hurdle that I've seen so far.
So basically, the main reservations that big corporations have is there haven't been enough successful use cases, or they're a bit wary because the cost of changing their whole infrastructures are going to be too high. Basically, that's the main
Yeah,
challenge.
because what I advise is that let's not transcribe these old, almost like paper and pencil processes onto a new technology. What you want to do is think about the processes and the technology that you want to have for the future. So what's that going to look like? So let's say I'll take an example of an airline. A lot of times when they have a lessor and a lessee, when they take over that aircraft to start operating a new aircraft, it's a little shocking, but the records are still paper, it's still DVDs. I don't even know what computers can accept DVDs anymore, and it's this fax machine of, like, rooms and rooms of records that you have to send when, let's say, a major carrier, like, say, Air France, takes over an aircraft from a lessor, and it's still this paper and pencil and fax process. So if we're struggling to move even something as sophisticated as airline records onto electronic records, like even a USB or a shared drive somewhere, how do we get them to then move over to a distributed ledger technology?
Yeah.
It's a lot of parts you have to change in addition to the mind.
Yeah. Does it also have to do maybe with the lack of knowledge in these industries about what blockchain really is, or what it can do to their industries?
Yeah, a lot of times people hear blockchain and the sexiness behind Bitcoin, and now you have NFTs. So, how do you explain this technology that supports Bitcoin, which is another kind of currency but isn't ruled by, let's say, a government entity? How do you explain how this technology also works in other areas, environments, and spheres? So, it the way I've broken it down is just think of DLT or blockchain as a database on steroids. And it's really beneficial when there are at least three parties who don't trust each other. Because if you have two parties who don't trust each other, why not just put it on a database that you can share? But if you have three parties, it gets more complicated. And what is that single source of truth? So being able to see everything that's appended onto all these transactions onto a single enormous database that's replicated across different servers, that's usually the best way I can analogize how to explain it.
And for now, what are the industry that saw like a faster adoption of DLT, or that, according to you, are going to see like a more rapid adoption of these technologies?
I'm hoping that Elon Musk and Tesla, because he has so much Bitcoin right now and he's going to accept Bitcoin as currency for purchasing Teslas. I hope that's a good one. I bought my Tesla with regular US dollars. And now I feel like, oh, I should practice what I preach and should buy it in Bitcoin in the future. But I think these kind of like big magnitude, high publicity kind of cases will make it more acceptable. But you also have to think about, okay, one of the coolest, if you're a disruptor, there's a lot of like cool advantages behind Bitcoin. You know, you're kind of off the grid a little bit. You don't have to worry about governments and how does it transfer from bank to bank. It's real time. It's a very fast transaction. But we're still operating in a world where corporations have to pay taxes. So how do you regulate this? And how do you make sure that if you do accept Bitcoin, will the US Treasury now have to take Bitcoin as a currency when you pay your taxes? Like there are all these interesting implications behind it.
And how do you see actually the regulations evolving in the US? Like,
That's a great question. I'm not sure because
yeah,
government's even slower than these big corporations as well. And the government also has a lot of record keeping that it needs to do, and they're in these silo departments with hundreds of thousands of people involved. One use case that I have seen that I think brings a lot of utility and like beneficial, how do I explain this? So with a lot of the refugees that have been moving around, there's not so much of a clear-cut business case, but they have lost their identity in a way because when you're fleeing your country from strife, you're not thinking about what passports and birth certificates do I take with me to establish my identity when I'm fleeing for my life and the safety of my family. So we have seen some use cases with the UN and reestablishing identities of refugees because if you're an educated worker, say like an engineer in one country, it's hard enough when you immigrate to another country to reestablish your credentials. A lot of times there are significant barriers of entry. And then if you compound that with a refugee situation, how do you reestablish even your basic birth certificate information, your nationality, and then even beyond that, how do you find yourself a job, get your social services in the new place that you're living in?
yeah. Actually, I find very interesting that regulations or governments generally are not very like following up on these technologies, even if they're very useful. And for instance, in the US, like in the US alone, there are 56% of investment on blockchain. So it's definitely something that people see value in. So it's very strange that like regulations are not following up that much on that. It's very peculiar.
Yeah, maybe in about 5 or 10 years we'll start to see it, but there's even cases where in certain states in the United States, marijuana has some level of legality, but then in terms of the federal government, it's still not a legal substance that you can take. So how do you tax that at a legally acceptable level at the state level? And then what do you do at a federal level as well to tax a business properly? And a lot of the transactions I think are happening on these non-fiat currencies like Ethereum or block or Bitcoin or cash. But there's a lot of there's a lot of danger in holding cash too. It's almost too liquid sometimes, and you are set up for maybe uh, like a you're an easy target for criminals that way as well. But then if you could pay your taxes in Bitcoin, or if you could regulate it better with Ethereum. I think that will be an interesting stepwise process in what do we do to decriminalize certain drugs and businesses.
Mhm.
Interesting. I was wondering actually when it comes to massive adoption and also creating more regulations to be able to talk about the topic. Do you think this is mostly the responsibility of the states or governments to boost this, or can corporate world also contribute in a way to this to this dynamic?
Yeah, if we had a good use case for like this private public partnership, it might be like faster adoption. But you've seen it in a lot of cases. Like if we use a throwback example where you have VHS tapes and then Betamax tapes, like Betamax was the superior technology, but for whatever reason, VHS had that hold on the market. And then even with cell phones, like in the past 20, 15 years, you've seen Nokia rise and fall, you've seen Blackberries rise and fall, and now you have all these apps that we use on our phone. So how do we drive that consumer behavior into adopting something? And it's, things have popularity and things have like clear superiority in technology, but I don't know what that magic formula is for mass adoption from all users and also like the government infrastructure as well. Maybe we could invent something like
Yeah,
it's the hearts and mind. It's like change management, and then
yeah, yeah.
there has to be that the money driving it as well as like what makes it more popular. Like in certain cultures, why is an iPhone more popular than Android? And yeah, I don't know.
And actually, how do you see the digitalization of assets? How is this evolving, and what do you think are the most, like, the more immediate practical applications of digitalization?
Yeah. Well, right now we've seen so much buzz around the non-fungible tokens and these digital assets that have embraced the use of Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to buy these. I still don't completely understand the utility of NFTs, but it's, these massive figures, like over $60 million to buy a digital assets. It's pretty mind boggling because other people can just take copies of it. But to be the original owner, I guess, has a cachet in and of itself. Uh, I, One of the areas I think if we consider it an asset is like medical data. Like if we could keep that on a DLT, it is secure, it's encrypted, you can put permissions on it so all of your, say, healthcare providers can see it. Or if there's an emergency situation and you have a card, can emergency medical technicians read it and say, okay, this person's allergic to penicillin, we can't treat this person, or other allergies, so we won't treat this person this way. And then all of your healthcare providers could have an accurate record of your medical records. Because even right now, I'm still taking paper copies from, oh, I'm going to go see an allergy specialist. Like, here's my history of immunizations. Or is it now an asset that I'm going to be vaccinated against COVID? So, do I have entry onto more airlines, countries? Like, can we consider our medical records an asset now? So that would be encrypted. People only who have permission to see my records can see my records. And then there's also a big safety component as well to it. So I'm now protected from, let's say, not being treated with a drug I might be allergic to.
I think it's very interesting that you're touching upon this topic because there is also like a huge industry of clinical trials, right? And how do you run them so that there is no fraud, basically? Like how do you ensure that like all the criteria is met when you're searching for participants for a vaccine, for instance? And I think like that might be also a very nice use case, like how to ensure that like all the data and all the predetermined criteria is in place and people do not like try to overcome it somehow like in a malicious way.
Yeah, or manipulated. Or we've seen this now with AstraZeneca and the efficacy of their vaccine. In certain studies, it looks more, there's greater efficacy, and then others, there's less efficacy. So could we put that on a single source of truth for us to verify faster instead of, I'm guessing they're shipping over via email or secure server. Here are the reams of data that you can review. But if you could look at it case by case with all the append only transactions, it seems like a faster way to look at it from the beginning rather than here's a dump of data, like please start evaluating it all over again.
Yeah, true, true.
Mm.
So, like blockchain governance, like gives the shareholders, like a lot of advantages in terms of transparency and flow of information and direct access to things. And how do you see the relationship between corporations and shareholders changing with the implementation of this technology? Or how
Is it
have you seen that changing?
so? Is it with the shareholders or maybe? I'm having a hard time following that one, Ariana. Is it like the proxy voting that we're looking at, or information about the company itself?
Well, basically, the relationship between the company and the ones that have um, interest in the company. Like,
To buy or yeah. Hmm. I mean, I guess what are we looking? We're usually looking at like the 10K, the filing records, and on occasion, like, okay, I'm guilty. Like sometimes I'll read some of the financial information, but even when the information is available to me, I'm accounting was my personal worst class, so I don't know if I even trust myself to read it properly. So I, I it kind of illustrates this balance of even though there's more information at hand, are we as humans that good of consuming it and interpreting it to something that we can use that's valuable? I think some other cases is if we look at the stakeholders involved in the company, like information is still very siloed within a corporation. So if we can have all the parties, like I get a lot of supply chain project work. So a lot of times it's because, let's say, sales is siloed this way, they're incentivized a certain way to always have product ready for a customer, and they don't take into consideration what that looks like for the warehouse or how much working capital is being tied up now, because it's you want to have a lot of items in stock to make your customer happy. Then you look at someone in the manufacturing side, and to produce everything that a customer needs, you have to change the machines all the time. You're not running the machines as efficiently anymore. So now these two are completely counter to each other. And then you have like the warehousing and logistics side, and there's this joke like if you build a warehouse, you'll fill it up with something. So it's a huge capital investment. And just because you build it, you're going to stuff it with widgets. And then you have, okay, how do I ship all of this stuff out to the customer? So if it's slower, it's usually a cheaper shipment. But if it's faster and you have to air freight it, then it's a more expensive proposition. So if you had all of this information to make the right decision in real time, I think that creates a lot of value within an organization to say, okay, I could stock like 20,000 units of this one item, but it's going to cost me this much to run the warehouse. I'm going to lose efficiency on my machines at the manufacturing site. So now they can see all of my decisions in these different organizations: sales, manufacturing, logistics, warehousing. They have implications against each other. And what I might think is best for my customer might be ruinous for the company overall.
So actually, it's very interesting that blockchain it's in a way disrupting as well the hierarchical and centralized corporate model. So
Mhm.
how actually do you think will be the necessary adjustments for corporations in order to kind of implement that efficiently in their organization?
Yeah, that's a really good point because blockchain can bring real time transparency to transactions, but there might be cases where you don't want things in real time. Like, let's say you have credit terms of 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Just because you have blockchain, do you want to pay it immediately in that instant your invoice is generated? Like, there's a lot of value in that time delay when you need to do a money transaction. So, let's set it up instead to say, okay, 60 days. Otherwise, maybe the default is you pay automatically as soon as that, like in my world, that shipment is sent to the customer. Does the customer now want to pay immediately? No, there's a lot of value in waiting 60 days to have that carrying cost be absorbed somewhere instead. So it's a lot of implications like that you have to think of. Or do we want, let's say you append new data onto a distributed ledger. Does everyone need to see it immediately? Is there some value in holding that transaction private for a while and then allowing certain parties to see it at certain times?
Mhm.
Like
Um,
maybe, like I'll give an example of that. I recently had appendicitis. So I had my biopsy results come back, but maybe the surgeon had reason to be like, okay, hold on, like I'm not going to tell her the results. Like the records are there, but it turned out it was like a precancerous cell situation. I'm glad I didn't, as soon as I had access to the records, wouldn't know how to interpret it. But the surgeon waited until we had time to meet face to face to kind of help me understand what my options would be now that these cells were found in my appendix.
Yeah, it's true. It's very tricky as a situation. There are a lot of things that one would have to consider because there is no like one kind of solution that can fit all situations and industry. That's why there is a lot of like thinking to do before implementing these. But I think that there are like still like the good thing about blockchain technology is that it seems still like rather adaptable to many situations, and so it's more like depending on the industry to decide what kind of organization they want to have and how and what kind of blockchain solution would be more adaptable for their model.
Yeah,
So in a
yeah,
way it's very fluid.
exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. I think, Sophia, did you have a question before? And
I was, yeah. I was wondering, since we touched upon the topic of the corporate life and more maybe like organizational cultures that are evolving, like also blockchain technology is a very innovative, disruptive thing. So I was wondering, for you as a business transformation leader, do you see any special features in the new teams, like blockchain-driven teams or organizations that are trying to be creative and innovative? Like, how do you see this whole phenomena?
Yeah, I think there's a greater importance on having data savvy people. And then not only that, it's the human plus machine equation that we're looking at now. Because we've seen so much misinformation because the algorithms, AI can tend to amplify certain voices. So how do we cull the biases and then also use that human side, the empathy side, and making sure that we're not inadvertently making ourselves a more biased decision making entity as well. So, bringing that marriage of people who understand data to the business implications to the human or customer implications as well.
And what do you think would happen if you, in such a creative, like where people do care about above mentioned things like data savvy, and you try to think about those kind of dynamics? Like, how do you think individuals already in the workplace, the ones who are already there for a long time, like the ones who are diverging from this creative vibe, like the ones who do not want really to be aligned with this, or who have some kind of struggles because they do not understand or they do not follow, or they feel abandoned because it's also new? Like, how do you think those people are behaving actually on the work floor?
Oh, it's been tough. Even my previous project, they do a lot of forecasting on Excel. So figuring out what parts do you need for a train locomotive. And we're like, okay, why not use this machine learning platform to do your forecasting? It's pumping out results that are even more accurate to your historical demand, and your forecasting is a lot more accurate. It's faster. It's taking data from your organization that you haven't even been able to consume or analyze yet. And it was just sheer resistance. Like, you're a black box, voodoo, magic beans. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
And that's the hard part with like machine learning too, because it's not going to tell you what process it took to come to this decision. It is a little bit closed in its own environment, but the results are achieving something that is more it's more advantageous to the organization, but because the people in the organization are having a hard time understanding it, and what happens to my job, like is my job gone now, or how am I supposed to learn this thing? It's a whole mind shift on how do we use data. Or the other thing we see is organizations that collect a huge amount of data and then nothing is done with it to show like what are we using this data for? Like, why are we collecting all this data? I don't know, like no one's using it, but you now have like ridiculous amounts of storage for your data that no one is using, but you're very proud that you have this data. And it's
You
marrying that, like, how do you the people who understand like locomotives to how do our customers use it to what is our organization going to do with it? It's really tough, like finding that trifecta of people who can use it effectively.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I was wondering, so we've discussed a little bit about some of your own clients having hesitance towards the switch to DLTs or general blockchain technology, or we've talked about trying to convince people or your clients in order to make this transition. I was wondering, do you have any specific examples that come in mind of people or industries or sectors that have successfully adapted to DLTs or blockchain technology, and how? What do you notice about them? Could you share some insight with us?
Yeah, so I do know of this one consulting firm that they tend to try out new technologies internally first. So they started rolling out DLT for some of their procurement processes and practices. And they the rationale for doing it is to say, okay, before we roll this out for our clients, how do we make it successful for ourselves? And then it's kind of like this piloting internally. So there were some successes with that. It's a scary thought. You're not owning your own data anymore. Like when you share it that way, who owns it? Like, how do you protect it? And how do you make sure that only the parties who need to see it see it? And it's such a paradigm shift from this is our data, we protect it, it's on our servers, no one else can see it, it's proprietary, this is the secret to our success. Even though we might not be analyzing it that much or using anything with the data, it's still mine and it's in my vault. So if you switch that to DLT is very successful when there are multiple parties who don't trust each other. So already the ground zero for that is we don't trust each other. And now you're telling me that I need to share my data and be open with these parties that I don't trust with the data. How do you convince them of that? And how do you convince them it's a more efficient process? So what we've seen in like transportation and freight systems is, yeah, there's a lot of distrust, but what if we could use GPS to track the shipment? Everyone can see where the shipment's going. And then there's no ambiguity that this invoice was calculated correctly because the amount of miles that were driven were tracked on the GPS. And then let's say the truck was held up at a warehouse, the trucker also needs to be compensated for that waiting time. That's all appended onto the GPS now. And then you can say, here's your invoice. Do you agree? And in the past, it was always like some guy would scribble on a piece of paper and say, like, oh, yeah, I waited here for 6 hours. So now you need to pay me for these 6 hours of waiting time. And there's just no way to verify any of that. It happened 3 months ago. It's on a crappy piece of paper that's all crumpled up. And someone's had to say, oh, yeah, it's accurate or not. And if you multiply this by thousands or even millions, you can think about how much waste is in the system due to this. But to say, okay, now a trucker I don't trust, who might be a mom and pop shop, and maybe they just use garbage bags to transport their sheets of paper every month. I've seen that too. Like, how do we get them to move beyond even email to say, now we're going to replicate on your servers this distributed ledger technology that no one seems to really understand completely. and we're going to make things super efficient, and you will be paid in exactly 30 days.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or even like trying to explain this to CFO sometimes. Like I've had to use that analogy. It's a database on steroids. And then I'm like, you can save 5% of $100 million. Like, can we start with that and see how we go?
I feel like this change, it's such a paradigm shift, as you explained so succinctly. And not only is it a paradigm shift in terms of data ownership, it's not just this firm's data, your firm's data anymore. It's very much, like you say, on a single source of truth. And I think for me, what's really fascinating is it'll also shift the paradigm of liability. Who's to blame when there's a failure? Who's going to absorb the costs of this mistake? And I wonder if you have some kind of insight or your own thoughts on how this paradigm shift is going to happen.
Yeah, the part that cracks me up is like you hear about all those like Bitcoin millionaires, but they can't access their Bitcoin because they can't remember their password. Like, how do we protect against human error? Like stuff like that. It's so hard. Like you can't reset that password. So what are we going to do with all this lost Bitcoin? Like it is, if you don't have something that basic, like your crappy 16-digit alpha-numeric numeral. Like, if you don't have that, you have lost access to millions of dollars. Like, there's got to be so much money just lost because of something like that. And then how do you regain it? Because now you've lost the utility of that currency. So something as basic as that, or then you even have to watch out about hacking too. So how do we protect against that? And if you're not a fiat currency, you don't have like the federal deposit insurance system backing you up. So is it just gone? Like, are we going to now create insurance infrastructure to protect uh, DLT based assets that we have? I'm not sure.
So actually, how do you see the future of corporations like going, like considering the rise of this technology and Web3? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we'll need to have savvy humans who can do, the data side of things, the business side of things, and then the human use and consumption side of things. Like those three are pretty key. But I was thinking back, like when did email rise in prominence? Like I remember when my family had a dial-up modem and we were using like AOL and stuff. And then when did we switch to Gmail? Like I kind of have an idea when I switched to Gmail. And when did we switch from paying for email to email essentially being free in a sense? Like someone's paying for it, but each email we send, the cost is so infinitesimal at this point that it's not even considered a cost. So I'm hoping that's something we can do with blockchain. Like right now, we might need a core group or consortium that does pay for it and sets up the server infrastructure for it. But then at some point, how does it shift into essentially being free, like email, and just being this is a source of record?
Yeah. Yeah, indeed. That's gonna be a crucial thing.
Yeah, or do we flip the model? And right now, why some of the disruptors like it is, okay, it's a single source of truth, no one owns it, and that's why we love it. But who's going to maintain the technology if we need to do more of the architecture behind it? Who do we need to pay to do that? So do we then flip it all together and say it's subscription based? Now we have specialty companies who set this up, and they're kind of this like third party. But it kind of goes against the ethos of blockchain because you're supposed to disintermediate third parties. But now are we bringing in a third or fourth party back in to essentially be a regulator for it?
Yeah. So what do you think that it's going to happen like in the next 5 years or so? Like what is your intuition about it?
I think the next Tesla I buy is going to be off of Ethereum or Bitcoin. I don't know. Like 5 years ago, I was really hoping when when Bitcoin hit like 18,000 or something, like my invention would take off and I would see it with all of the major shipping and transportation companies. And that totally hasn't happened. I've kept my day job and I'm still working in consulting. But it's like it's so irregular, like how things evolve and how people adopt them. So if I like in terms of being a futurist, I'd say I'm pretty bad with that. But maybe now we're finally gaining enough traction. Like if Elon Musk is saying like, yeah, you can buy a Tesla using Bitcoin, if we can have enough mass production of Tesla, like if it's as prominent as something as like a Toyota, maybe that will start to shift. Yeah, or I can buy flights on SpaceX using Bitcoin or Ethereum. Like, is that enough? But I feel like it's a very small niche of people. Like, there aren't that many Teslas. There aren't that many people who want to go to space. Like, maybe it has to go back to like how unequal our society has become and the chasms that have been created, like that we've seen through the pandemic now too. Like, is there a certain class of people who are really adopting like cryptocurrencies versus people who are really struggling during this pandemic? And, that's beyond the realm of possibility for them.
Yeah, maybe follow up on Ariana's question, but like to take a step back, was there when you decided to engage, or maybe there was a more of a gradual process for you, like to engage in the crypto space and to work more around blockchain? Was that the external pressure from from work or other factors for you, or was there some underlying value personally that you found like this is something that is going to change life for me or for other people? Like, what was the motivation behind it for you?
Yeah, we had this internal Shark Tank where each of these teams had like different emerging technologies we were researching. So some of it was like AI, others were machine learning, and my team happened to choose blockchain. And it was a personal driver for me because as soon as I know there's a competition, like I'm not going to do anything but try to win this competition, even though I don't even think there's a prize attached to it. Like I just had to win this competition. So we found out later there's going to be like some seed money to go invent this. And we're like, all right, like we beat all the other teams. Like we have this mystery seed money that we didn't even know before. We just wanted to win. So now that we won, we're like, oh no, like now what do we do? It's like that old movie, The Candidate with Robert Redford. Like he's this politician and he's like trying so hard to win this election because he's this long shot. And then when he wins, he's like, now what do we do? And I was like, oh my God, now what do we do? Like we want this thing. Like we have so much publicity at our company now. So my teammate and I found out that there was this blockchain academy training in Dublin, and she's based in Houston. I'm based in New Jersey. And we're like, okay, whatever. Like, your dad's a travel agent. Like, we're getting on planes and we're going to go crash this thing in Dublin. And like, I don't even care if we get in trouble, like, whatever. Like, we can't code this ourselves. We need to find some architects. Like, how are we going to even do this? So we like basically met up in Dublin, and it was supposed to be in this like hotel conference room. And I get there and I'm asking the front desk and they're like, oh no, it's not here anymore. I'm like, oh my God, like I just flew across the Atlantic. I can't even find anyone to do this training anymore. So I found out they had shifted it to one of our offices in Dublin. So I was like trying to reach my friend, even though she was flying. I'm like, it's not at this hotel. Like, do not show up at this hotel. Like, you got to go to the main offices. So we went there and basically we were like annoyingly pitching ourselves to like every architect in that crappy like subdivided conference room at the office to be like, will you help us build our technology? Because now we're these like junior consultants who won this like internal. It was so like ridiculous, like the lengths we went to. And then I was like, oh my God, like we have this. I think we need to patent this now. Like otherwise, who knows? Like we could just start pitching this to our clients and maybe they'll steal our idea or a competitor will steal our idea. So we ended up going through this whole intellectual property patenting process. So we have patents on in the US, China, Japan, Singapore, and the EU. Because I was like, they're stealing my baby. Like I worked so hard for it. It's like, no one else is crazy enough to just like jump on a plane and like crash this party. Like our names are not on the attendance list or anything, but we're like, well, we're here. Like you can't kick us out. What are you gonna do? Like I'm just gonna see if you can build this for us. But it also kind of taught me like, oh, being an entrepreneur is going to be really tough for me because I'm thinking like every second I'm not working on this, like I'm losing money and like someone's going to steal my stuff and like how do I work on this? So I learned a lot about myself, but it was like looking back, I'm like, that was crazy. Like it was just this like extracurricular thing that took on a life of its own. And I've loved it. Like I learned so much about it, the people you meet, like speaking at conferences, and then even thinking about how do I explain this to different audiences who might not be as tech savvy or only understand blockchain in terms of cryptocurrency.
And that's actually a great story. Yes.
Who's this crazy person who's like like banging on doors, like, let me in, are you an architect, like do you want to build this for me, we got some like seed money.
Indeed, I think it's very recognizable, especially in the entrepreneurial space, especially in the crypto space. I think it's a lot of people would agree with you on that kind of like, mood that you're experiencing. Still,
Yeah,
that's great.
it's like we have no shame, I don't care what you say, like I'm gonna keep trying.
Well, it was definitely worth it.
I hope so. Yeah, I would love to see in like 5 years, like everyone's using my invention, like FedEx and UPS, but I don't know. Just to name a couple of examples, but yeah, it's people, it's hard to have people like totally think about this differently. It's so different from like, it's not a tangible asset. It's something you have to share. It's a naked database now. And do you really want to show everything underneath the covers?
Yeah. So do you guys have other questions perhaps, or
I was thinking maybe like as a closing question, like do you maybe see like any potential trends or any potential projects that you're like, we don't have to go into concrete names, but something that you think will be very, very interesting in the coming year or five within the blockchain or crypto in general, something that you find insightful?
I would love to see it used more in like the medical space or humanitarian space, really. Like there's so much that we depend on. Like what happens if I lose my documents in a fire? Like why are my medical records so inefficient? Like when I had that appendectomy, I was like, wow, that's a really nice hospital, but it takes like 5 hours to get anything done. I want to get out of here. Like, so if there's a faster way to do that, and not like, why do I physically have to carry my medical records between the hospital and then to like my regular doctor? Like, why? Or even when I had another biopsy done, like the surgeon physically couldn't find my records from the pathologist. So I'm like, this is crazy. Like, why is this done manually on paper? Why can't we have each person's records be on a secure database that's enabled by distributed ledger technology? I would personally love that. And if we can have our finances secured enough that we can just use face recognition on our phone on an app to access my financial records, like why can't I do that with my own medical records? It's mine. And yet I have all these gatekeepers that kind of stymie me from having it quickly and accurately. Yeah. It's like if you have a cancer scare, you want to know whether you have cancer or not. So it's like, come on, Dr. Smith, like why can't you find my records? It's been 3 weeks now. So frustrating.
yeah.
And I think especially now, I mean, you mentioned your own vaccination with mass vaccinations rolling out. This kind of real-time digitization of data and records will be so useful and so pertinent to
Yeah.
the situation today.
Totally. Yeah. Like, can I go? I mean, not that I would go to like a warehouse party, but can I go to a crowded warehouse party now because I'm vaccinated? Like, But the tricky one is, how do you connect that physical world to the digital world? So what is that authentication process that's going to happen between my vaccination and the actual record? Like in the past, I had that yellow vaccination card I would carry with me if I wanted to go backpacking somewhere. But is there going to be a market for counterfeit vaccination cards now? Like, how do we authenticate? Like, my card is just like a white little slip of paper that's slightly too big for my wallet. It's a little awkward, and it's someone's like handwritten note that I got the Moderna vaccine on these days. Like, this is my vaccine passport? Like, how do we digitize this?
Maybe we could have a vaccination NFTs.
Yeah. Is there a QR code I can scan and then it uploads onto an app on my phone? Like, that would be cool. But what is that link between the physical and the digital that I can now carry as a token around with me as my record of truth?
Yeah.
I'd love to see that. If we could roll that out. Like, I know New York State has a vaccine passport, but I don't know what the mechanics of it are.
Yeah, it would definitely be great to see more improvements in this area, because right now it's very inefficient. Like,
Yeah. Oh, don't even get me started.
yeah, for documents as well. It's
Oh.
very, yeah. I still have like a paper ID card from Italy, so
Yeah, what happens if you lose it? Like, do you have to go back to Italy? Do you have to collect your birth certificate? Like, I don't, it like scares me to think about that process.
yeah, it's pretty lengthy. It happened to me a few times, and
Oh no.
it's ridiculous considering like the technological capacities that we have nowadays that could make life of people so much easier. But still, we're very far from that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. I'd love
Anyway,
to see it.
thank you a lot for joining us for this conversation, and yeah, keep
Thank
in
you. It was awesome. Yeah,
touch.
I loved it. And let's have more women inventors. That's my other big thing. Like, be brave, be shameless, like go pound on doors and crash training sessions. It's worth it.
No, but we were very thankful. Thank you so much for your time. That was extremely interesting. And I think also like a lot of people would agree with us that like those topics are becoming so relevant. So that's good to have it.
Love it. Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you, Yei Sung.
Okay. See you guys. Bye.
Bye.